It's very common for young men influenced by Carl Jung's concept of the anima to have a romanticized view of the feminine, that there is something pure, somewhat spiritual, and innately healing about the essence of some real-life women. Passively holding this one-sided view is a huge trap that we've seen many young men walk into through no real fault of their own, time and time again. We hope that this video, derived entirely from Steve and Pauline Richards' 43 years each of frontline clinical experience, can stand as a practical means to understand it, and hence avoid it. In Jung's writings on the anima, and in the words of internet gurus speaking about the concept online, what you find is mythologized language and constructs, which suggest the presence of a certain qualia of image. If the anima as an idea has any reality to it at all, it must exist within the context of biology and evolution. This context, because of the way the idea is often presented, is lost, concealed behind the impression of an idealized image. Or, in other words, consciousness, instead of being gained, is instead occupied by a fantasy view of the reality of human nature. If a real-life woman appears in form to match this image, for example, they appear to be highly vulnerable, but with an appearance and demeanour that suggests something transpersonal, as per Jung's anima, then the man is likely to project his so-called anima out onto her, and all the ideas and impressions which have been instilled in him through suggestion around this image constellate with it. The trap is thus: whilst the man sees only his projection, de facto he does not see the whole reality of the woman standing right in front of him. If she is so inclined, consciously or unconsciously, he risks falling victim to any power drive or frustrated instinct, Adler or Freud respectively, that may be operating through her. At this point, if he becomes aware he is being manipulated, he may reciprocally project out the Jungian opposite of the idealized image. Suddenly, she becomes the negative anima, a so-called death demon as Jung described it, mythologized as an evil predator, succubus or witch. This too is a trap. It doesn't reflect lived reality within its very real biological and evolutionary context. It is a maladaptive suggestion. Women are not the anima. As Steve Richards has pointed out, if the anima exists at all, it must be a part of masculine psychology, his relating function, which guides the flow of energy and information within himself and his psychosocial relationships. Thus, if an idealized so-called anima image is guiding his relating, this is potentially highly dangerous, as it will guide him into unconsciousness within his relationships, whilst Freud and Adler are constellated behind it. Ego strength can be gained immediately if we adopt a superpositioned view of human beings. Man and woman are both superpositioned between biology, psychology, and social relationships. Each of these is a single form of informational representation, collapsed down into an ego perception for the purpose of analysis, description, and explanation. But where one is present, so too are the others. Therefore, concealed behind the projection of an anima image sits the woman's biology, shaped via evolution in the Paleolithic, superpositioned into her psychology, and superpositioned still into her persona and social relationships. To understand this is the antidote to the Jungian trap. Good relating, in line with proper adaptation and homeostasis, can resume, and the one-sided naivety of the projection put aside. With this essential background explored, we'd like to play for you a series of clips from a recent high-level IPSA professional training seminar, hosted by Steve and Pauline Richards. Steve and Pauline were presenting a highly complicated original clinical case study from 1994, which they have used, among many other purposes, to prepare male therapists for the reality of Freud and Adler being concealed behind certain presentations of, and subsequent projections onto, the feminine. Of course, in this clip, Steve and Pauline are speaking from a clinician's perspective, but the clinician's experience is always a very concentrated form of the dynamics of everyday life. In ordinary relationships between men and women, this scenario plays out too. We hope that by learning from Steve and Pauline's experience, that insight can be carried across into daily life and help improve relating for men and for women. We really hope that you enjoy.
But in terms of teaching, I think it's really valuable, and it was at the time, to point out to the men who, when we were training them then back in 1994, were learning about Jung. They hadn't been soaked in it before they'd even come to us. So in that sense, it was easier to help to prepare them for the problems that come about from being exposed to Jungian ideas, because they hadn't been exposed to them, but they were being exposed to them through training and having that put into a clinical perspective. As men needing to be trained about how to deal with things that turn up, and they haven't had a sophisticated articulation to deep psychodynamics, then they need to understand that, because it prevents harm to everybody. And that's part of the barefoot approach as well, to being able to experience these things with a degree of objectivity. But that objectivity can only come through, first of all, having the right preparation through theory, the proper connection to theory, and then a proper understanding, as far as is possible, of yourself. That's the best preparation anyone can have, and it's still difficult. So somebody comes along and has a fanciful interpretation of Jung, a romantic one, a romanticized one, will walk into a terrible trap with some kinds of presentation of the feminine, particularly when it's superpositioned. So you've got vulnerability and you've got an imago, which has no substance. All the substance appears to be in the distress and the disorder. Now, if you think about that as a man, and about how Jung's anima is supposed to function as a psychodynamic, that is a Venus flytrap for a man. Because there is the insubstantial presentation, which is suggestive of something which is almost transpersonal. But the only substance that's in that person is a very deep neurosis. Now, that's a cave you do not want to walk into psychologically. So the preparation for that is important. And exactly the same thing operates for women, for female therapists who experience men. Provided the combination is right, the effect is exactly the same. So Jung is right that these things are real and that they exist and that they operate. What I would say is that part of the problem with Jung is the way that he constructs his own understanding of it, based on the fact that he broached proper boundaries with so many women that he encountered, and he produced a theory based on things going wrong. And that's it. It's a model of pathology, Jung. His model of the shadow is a pathological model that he put together to explain how he couldn't deal with aspects of himself that properly belonged to Freud and Adler. So he invents the shadows to accommodate that. And he did the same thing with the anima. But if we can separate that out, distill that out, not identify with Jung, but say, what can I see and experience? What is he reporting? Let's bring them together and see how they mix. And then you can get some objectivity. And then you can say, yeah, actually, there is such a thing that appears in the way that Jung said that it did. There really is a thing that we could collapse into representation and say it is, for example, the anima. And it can be a trap. And at that point, most Jungians bifurcate and go off into fantasy. And it's at that point we have to be real and we have to be forensic, because that protects the other person and it protects us. Because the real bottoming out of the anima in a clinical situation where you're exposed to something that can be like this has to do with an understanding of the superpositioning of biology into psychology and then into social and environmental relationships. Superpositioning, if you understand that properly, explains this. It gives you a place to stand and to be objective about yourself. But if that understanding is missing, you're left only with the impression of the image. And as I say, if the image lacks substance, that's the Venus flytrap, particularly if that person is deeply disturbed, because you're being invited into the trap. And that's the repetition compulsion that people suffer from very often, that manifests as transference. They bring it in and say, we're going to replay everything that I've experienced before. And that includes all of my Adlerian power grabs and my adaptations to status and the lack of it. I will weaponize my neurosis to manipulate the therapist and maintain my state of ill health, whilst destroying the persona of the therapist and destroying their efficiency clinically. And I move on to the next one. That's what that happens a lot, and it happens with the so-called animus as well. So the better prepared you are, and the more intact you are with respect to the understanding of yourself, the more you can help others. And sometimes help means you have to be objective enough to say, this isn't going to go anywhere that's healthy for anyone. And that's a reason why Paul and I very often, in the past, certainly exchanged patients between one another, because the transference was such that it would be better if it was a woman that Pauline worked with her, or a man if I worked with him, or they bring in their partner and we both come in, and then we bypass a lot of the traps that litter the Jungian road. They're like landmines ready to go off, and if we're not alert to them, we walk over them. So in a teaching sense, I think this is a really good case for men to learn from, and understand that the anima, as Jung made the observation, is real. His description of it is deficient. To understand what it really is to make yourself safe, or as safe as it's possible to be, from these unconscious psychodynamics, which are a field phenomenon and include the manipulation of the unconscious in the person of the therapist. And if that therapist has had an inadequate exposure and understanding of Jungian psychodynamics, they are primed to harm themselves and others. So it's hugely important that this is taken on by the guys that we have with us at the moment.
I think one point you make, Steve, which is particularly helpful and practical really as well, is the way in which the positive anima of it often disguises the negative.
Oh, yeah.
That's what you receive first, but it's not what's actually being delivered. No. And the only thing I can think of to kind of illustrate that right now is, say, something like the Kate Bush video, Experiment 4.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Which is just a kind of a visual representation of how that thing happens.
Yeah.
But it's if you don't know it, it's worth checking out, because you can kind of see, you know, being acted out, some of these dynamics. And I just think it's a good example of it.
Yeah, it is a very good one, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, called Experiment 4 with Roman numerals, that's isn't it? Yes. Kate Bush.
Yes, Kate Bush,
Yeah, where you see her pull the mask off, and then what's underneath it is not nice at all after she's beguiled her victims. Right. And that is a kind of a Jungian metaphor.
It is.
But with Jungian material, you've got to be so careful you're not pulled into the fabric of the metaphor, because that's when fantasy intrudes. And that means that the unconscious then penetrates into the ego loses its adaptation. And then we see the metaphor as reality, even though we think, oh, the metaphor is telling me that there's something nasty behind that face, that she'll just pull it off, and there's the evil, there's the thing that's going to suck the breath out of my lungs, which is what this demon does in the which is your life force. But because the positive one's there, and I prefer that, it cancels out the fact that the negative is also represented. So Jungian material is great, but don't allow it to possess your consciousness.
It's just meant to illustrate something, really, isn't it? They're more than that.
Yeah. That's where they fall down. And that's why what they do takes years. And they still get nowhere.
In the next clip, Steve and Pauline discuss some of the psychosocial implications of the case, multiple aspects of the patient's persona, and a nickname that she used for herself, which we've anonymised, were weaponised outwards in an attempt to control the people around her. Principally her husband, but also the course of therapy. As Steve and Pauline are about to discuss, if someone puts up a lot of impediments to getting better, then it begs the question, what's really going on psychodynamically?
The delicacy was almost like the fairy princess, though, as well, in the myth, and the princess and the P.
Yes.
So, the princess who slept on, I think 70, wasn't it, mattresses in the end.
Yeah.
I could feel a P beneath the lowest one. That there was always going to be something that would disturb and distress her, no matter what was done, and that was the frustration in the husband, I think.
Yeah.
What can I do? Everything is provided, all these mattresses stacked up, she should be comfortable, the materialism, the status, and she's not. So that was the puzzle for him, and we didn't push it, but I've no doubt that, and partly because of the transferential issues onto you, the mother transference that was coming at you, had we pushed it, she would have overamped the physical symptoms to push us away, made it worse. But behind that was the fact that not only had she created the name, but that was a Freudian thing, in the sense that it was aimed at other people. So she'd weaponized that, as she'd probably weaponized her anorexia and other things as well. And that's the more malignant side, that when we try to hold someone in a state of relative safety and adaptation, you can't push them. But had we been able to push them, then personally, I think that's where we would have gone, both of us, with that together. But there was so many impediments to getting close enough to do it. And she left this impression of being a flower, or like a bouquet of flowers, delicate flowers. That's what she was like in presentation. And that kept people away, because she's too delicate to be challenged.
She can't be pushed on it.
No. So there's something more in the background, I think, behind all of that. And Freud would definitely take her persona as being weaponized, which is something the Jungians miss on very often. The fact that the symptoms are very often constellated to be aimed at people in a compensatory way that Adler would have understood and said, this is her attempt to control. And that would include all of her symptoms too. But that's the shadowy side, isn't it? And we shouldn't push that unless we can safely, I think.
You have to be able to safely manage the fallout from something like that. Again, as I recall, there were lots of fingers in the pie. There were a lot of other medical interventions going on, and so we just didn't have.
Well, he just bought the best of everything, the husband, didn't he? Whatever she wanted, she got. And it was never enough. And that was one of the alarm bells that went off in me. When I look at someone's persona, I want to know how that figures literally as a figure against the background, and where is the mismatch. And the mismatch is indicated through the symptoms, and the symptoms are either real because the person is a victim, or they're partially real and partially weaponized within the context of the background. And then what we see is what presents, and sometimes what presents is meant to distract us. So a man working with a woman like that, particularly if he was into Jung, would have to be very, very careful that he did not constellate Jungian fantasies about what he was experiencing. Because they say that fairy-like Botticelli kind of painting, the living thing that came in and then was all weak and vulnerable, a lot of men would be so disarmed, they'd be unable to see what was really happening. And that's another reason why this is instructive, I think, for the guys here, that the image of what you experience, and for the women too, if they experience this in men or whatever combination of relationship that is favored by your particular relating function, that it's that which is the most disarming thing of all, potentially, because of the way that we're set up to deal with the image of another person biologically. And we have to be really, really careful about that. What presents is not the reality, because it's decontextualized. And that is a snapshot of the context that stood behind it. But it included a husband and his family and everything else. And then when that's all considered, the symptoms make sense, some sense. But the overall thing is we couldn't push this. And Pauline, even then, was such a caring human being that she reached out wanting to help this girl, and I think she did with full genuineness of spirit and of heart. So within that limited bandwidth, she did everything she possibly could. But I would see that as more of a malignant presentation than anything else. I know that's judging the person, but I'm trying to judge the overall context and see where the dynamics fit. Then downstream of that, update it if need be. But without that context, then what you see is distracting, and that can happen, I would say.
Yeah, oh, I agree with you completely, Steve. And yes, personas, interesting things, aren't they, really?
They are.
You know, the Jungians are dismissive of them, but they're constructed for a reason, and some are more elaborate than others, some are more alluring than others. There's, you know, and it's the first thing that you meet or see clinically. Yeah. And you have to know how to manage that, and your own reactions to it.
Yeah, I mean, she was like the ultimate wounded woman in a fairy tale-like way. And that's only the top of the story. I mean, there's so much in there which suggests things that may have gone on when she was a child that have led to being like that. Oh my God, this needs unpacking. But if you try and unpack it, you'll harm her. So she presents as, I need this unpacking, but if you do that, you will seriously harm me. Yeah. So therefore you can't go there. Yeah. And it's okay. So what's trying to work itself through at this point? And I say a young, inexperienced, Jungian orientated male therapist could have been pulled into fantasy there simply because he would think this is the anima, probably. He wouldn't even think it. It would just emerge out from within, and then he becomes completely ineffective, and then will get metabolized by the transference and left in a terrible state himself. And we need to talk about these things because it happens, and it happens to women, you know, say heterosexual female therapists who experience the classical Jungian animus in the same way. You know, so there's a lot to learn from something like this. That on the surface, it's obvious. And then you guys have been pointing out things beneath the surface, which is great. And then beneath even that, there is the field dynamic, which is running everything, which is very complicated. This particular guy who had a lot of money and he had a high-powered job from a wealthy family, and his father was very high up in neuroscience, intellectual, and offered and gave everything she could want, and it wasn't right. Therefore, something's being aimed at him as well. And he'd fallen for the image, and at the level of the persona, and couldn't understand what was going on. That's another huge indication that there are multi-level issues playing out. So yeah, but you guys will have experienced this in your own life, and you will experience it through working in therapy. It's interesting what you can learn from it. But I would always say to the men, never go in with Jungian spectacles on to anything. No. At all, because you're already at a disadvantage based on your own capacity to project. It's already there, it's already in place. And even if the person themselves is genuinely wounded and does not intend to hurt you, another part of them does. And that's the bit that goes back down to that fundamental primate level of consciousness and status and rank. How do you get rank? How do you do that? If you're wounded in a certain way, you utilize the wound to manipulate others. And that was happening, as I recall, through every level of where she was operating. Yeah, definitely. And actually, I remember the woman who recommended her to come and see Pauline was another woman, not as badly damaged as her in the obvious sense, but she was dainty and fairy-like, and she was married to a very powerful and dominating and narcissistic man, because perhaps he saw her as the perfect victim. But she just collapsed into this in an attempt to pull help from someone into her, but at the same time did not want to do anything about it. So she was the perfect friend for this girl. And we did manage to help the First Lady very effectively, and her husband, although he was very rejecting and he didn't like the idea of any psychological intervention. He was very, very cautious about that and about anything, even medical interventions. He didn't like his wife having any of them. But she was more easy to reach than this girl. This girl was a real problem because she was superpositioned in different states simultaneously. There was the vulnerability, which was partially real and partially fake. Then there was the overcompensation for rank that was operating. Then there was the real day-to-day issues that she had, and the relationship to her husband, relationship to her mother and her father.
In the next clip, Steve and Pauline highlight how essential it is to model what you see as part of an overall biopsychosocial field of information. This field includes the persona, but also what's behind the persona, as in the full set of psychodynamics at work, and the other people involved, principally the patient's husband. The whole system needed to be managed, and thus a forensic mindset was instrumental in working out what was going on at a deep structure level. However, as is also discussed, and essentially so, relating was, and indeed always is, the key skill to managing the case.
Are different responses to the same person, albeit, that you saw, I only saw it 2 or 3 times.
Yes.
Shows that it is a field phenomenon, because we both experience different aspects of that complete person.
Yeah.
And that's based on the fact of who we are, obviously, but also how a person presents, and then the mindset that you take to interpret what you experience. I mean, sometimes my more forensic approach, not more than Pauline's, but just more in emphasis personally, can distance me from some things that would be far better dealt with in a more humanistic sense. And Pauline was ideally configured for that, for all sorts of reasons at that moment in time, where I was very, very aware of being an intrusion potentially into something like that. And that gave me enough distance, I think, to be analytical almost about the situation.
Yeah.
And that then goes into the repository of experience, and you compare that with previous experiences, with theories, and then you get an overall impression of the situation. But it's still relatively one-sided. So the best approach would emerge from both of us, but distilled and skewed more towards Pauline to meet her real needs in the moment. Had it gone on and had it been safe, then I think I would have felt inclined to deploy that forensic approach, but it wasn't right. And that gave me that sense of distance, and then to be analytical about it, and to draw out what I can in terms of understanding.
Yeah, I think that's true, Steve. I think that's a very fair appraisal of it, really, because I think if you'd have gone in too forensically,
the damage there.
Well, you probably would have reminded her, not necessarily in a positive sense, of her husband and her father-in-law as well, and that might have just seemed too intimidating.
And it would have been.
Yeah, and it probably would have been.
It would have been. But back in the day then, most of our students were female. Now it's more male.
Yeah.
And that's why, really, because we've got a lot of guys now on the card, is why I'm mentioning the importance, and because of the way that Jung has suddenly become really popular and is in the forefront of so many young men's mind. Particularly on issues like the anima, and then them relating to themselves. That makes this kind of case something that, as therapists, they should be aware of.
Yes.
How dangerous Jungian ideas are if you just blindly follow them.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that's why I'm emphasizing that. And your question, Julia, to Pauline about the relationship to Pauline is important, because it draws out the other side of the equation that, if it were only me speaking, would be concealed. So you've actually helped to bring out both sides of that and that representation of the field.
Yeah.
In the next clip, Steve and Pauline speak further on the potential for secondary gain in the case. In short, this means that the neurosis had several layers to it. The one everyone would see was the presentation of suffering, as all neurosis brings. But there was another aspect, concealed by the crafted persona, that deliberately sought out Adlerian control and gratification. As such, to manage this as best as possible, although the patient had a transference onto both Steve and Pauline, it was Pauline that was best placed to treat her. Steve, simply for being a man, would have drawn a certain kind of response that would have amplified her complexes and further complicated the case.
I wouldn't have wanted to have worked with it. I would not have wanted to, because it would have been obvious that just being male would have made that problematical for the reasons that you said. And then any use of hypnosis would have just made things worse in terms of transference. So Pauline was the right choice by far. But it was interesting to come in for a few sessions when her husband was there and have that sense of distance, and then to attempt to understand the field, as you mentioned, in a different way, and then put that into the bank, into the repository of experience, and measure that against theory and test the theory and so on. And that was another reason why we did that case study, wasn't it?
Yes. I know I keep saying this, but just such a complicated, multi-level case with so much secondary, to come to the point that was made before about secondary gain, so much potential secondary gain attached to it as well. And you see this a lot with anorexics, the amount of control that they have, not only over their own bodies, but over their own families and the people around them. They have a massive amount of control, and they tend not to want to give that up easily. They're a very difficult group of people by and large to work with in that respect. And I don't know if anything would have been of sufficient strength to overcome that, other than some kind of deep structure, archetypal solution, really transcendent experience, in effect, one which had a sufficient amount of meaning attached to it at a deep structure level, that she could literally have just reconfigured herself and released her genomic potential properly. But given all the other complications of the case, it was so difficult. Maybe it did happen further down the line. Who knows? We don't really know.
We don't know.
Because we don't know the absolute outcome of it. But I think fundamentally the change would have needed to happen at that level, because she was so damaged and so disordered. And like I said, there was so much secondary gain, so much controlling of other people's lives, that it would have taken something of that strength, I think, to create a change. Those anorexics whose body weight falls to such a level that they have to be hospitalized tend to be treated in that way. You know, it's very much a kind of a CBT regime where everything is monitored, their weight is monitored. You know, they have to have somebody accompany them to the toilet. They're not allowed to go to the toilet for an hour after they've eaten, you know, that kind of thing. There's an awful lot of oversight in that behavioral sense of what's going on, and oftentimes they get back to a stable weight, and they're discharged from hospital, and then the whole thing collapses again, and they relapse, and they're readmitted, and so they just become the usual revolving door patients. So I think you're right to say that maybe had she gone that route, it would have just been another intervention. It would have been somebody else giving her attention, actually. And sometimes this happens in therapy, that patients accrue a lot of people around them, and that way, you know, they are literally being fed with attention, and that's all part of the secondary gain. And then the more that you include in that, then obviously the harder it is to break as well, because there's so much more input going on. And you know, it's what Steve said before, it's that Freudian idea of targeted symptoms. And there's no doubt that anorexics and bulimics target their eating disorder at people, at their family and their friends, and healthcare professionals who are involved in their care. So it's hard, because if you challenge them, the threat is that I will kill myself. That's a subtext. If you push me too far, I'll drive my weight down to such an extent that I will take myself out of the equation completely. And that's, you know, that's not a nice threat to have to work under, really, when you actually want to help someone in a humanistic sense. So they're a difficult group of people to work with.
I'd say even in the absence of anorexia with this lady, that the implicit threat was that if you push me, I'll somatocyze. Look how good I am at somaticizing.
Yes.
I'll develop another illness and it'll be your fault.
Yes, that's right.
And the husband was like, what do I do? I've done everything. And he was feeling helpless. Whereas you were the right person.
Well, I did as much as I could.
You were the right person. Because it'd be very hard for her to manipulate you without demonstrating that's exactly what she was doing. So in that sense, you were alchemically right for that.
But probably at the time. I think so much of our relationship, and I said this to Julia earlier, was implicit. We had a kind of implicit understanding of one another and where we were both at on our own reproductive journey, really. And I wanted to model more than anything else. And like I say, this goes beyond words. How that could happen for her, and even just something like demonstrating a normal body weight and being pregnant and being comfortable about that was important, because, you know, that's what you give off, or I was aware that I would be giving off as a therapist and as a woman. So I had to manage that. I had to manage my own persona, if you like, in such a way that I used it as effectively as I could. And so much of what we did together was at that level, and didn't require, you know, any kind of sort of CBT overlay, or even penetrating in-depth psychodynamic work. There was an understanding, kind of an agreement between us. And if anything was going to work, I think it would have been that. But I've no way of knowing, because I still to this day don't know the outcome.
And therefore, I mean, I understood at the instinctive level that was a no-go area for me. On the level of simply being a man, and then my actual style of working, and put those two together, that was not a place where I could be properly effective. But that's how we work, isn't it? We've always worked like that and moved things around in that way.
But I think you are absolutely instrumental in keeping her husband in the ballpark, keeping him in play, because you can imagine that the stresses on him were such
huge,
that what the heck he felt he was doing everything he possibly could for her at every level, and he was running out of options fast, and his resources were depleting. So to have somebody who at least I think in terms of a style sense could establish rapport with him and help him understand maybe in different ways what it was his wife was going through. I think it was incredibly helpful and important.
Thank you. That's a point I would recommend to all of you guys, is that find someone of the opposite biological sex that you can work with closely, so you can offer that. So I could model something like a normal male response to the field that was presenting without being critical of her, but also being normal for him, and providing some kind of backup to why I thought that this could have been a case that could be solved. So in other words, relate to the man as a man, and not simply dial my own masculinity down so that we both become feminized. And that would have upset the triangulation of that relationship, wouldn't it? And therapeutically. So you have to be the man sometimes, humanistic but supportive. So if you can find someone to work with, you know, that'll be helpful in situations like that.
I know. I think it was incredibly important. It played a huge role in maintaining his stability in the face of what he was up against.
Yeah.
And, you know, a bit of logos at the right time, in the right way,
Yeah.
very effective.
Yeah.
And I think you had to appeal to him like that because he was a rational sort of guy.
Yeah.
And, you know, he wouldn't have wanted... I'm going to have to say this, a kind of a mamby-pamby counselling approach. He would have just rejected that out of hand.
Yeah.
So you were the right person
for that element.
Yeah, for that element of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a systems thing, as John was saying earlier, really. There's a systems element to it.
Yeah.
In the next clip, one of our students undergoing professional training at IPSA asked if it would be beneficial to teach self-hypnosis to patients with anorexia, perhaps so that they could develop the ability to better regulate their psychobiology. Steve and Pauline answer this question with reference to the very real phenomenon of Thanatos, the genomic drive towards returning to an inorganic state, that, to varying magnitudes, is often implicated in the progression of anorexia. To highlight how Thanatos works, they discuss another case study, for which Steve sought supervision from Professor Ernest Rossi. The patient had cancer, but 32 years prior had predicted the day he was going to die. There was the organic presentation of the disease, but also a clear psychosomatic aspect too, in the form of Thanatos. In the end, Thanatos prevailed, and he did indeed die on the day he had predicted. In other words, he set his own clock. Following this, Steve and Pauline then discuss how Thanatos was implicated in the core case study being discussed in this video, and its nuanced adaptive purpose for existing in the genome in the first place.
I think at the right time, depending on where they were at, if they were really far down the road and skeletal, I wouldn't do that. If they were recovering, I'd consider it, but I'd still be careful, because the thing about Thanatos, when it operates at that level, is that is now the self-regulating principle of the organism. So if you give Thanatos the power to regulate and augment its regulation, it could, in theory, accelerate death.
Yeah.
So this is what we have to make, and it's like that with people who are suicidal. If we're not careful, we could hypnotize someone, say, who is suicidal, and then they get the ego strength to do it.
Yeah.
Because the Thanatos components is then strengthened.
Yeah.
So where there are things like that present, then I can think of the anorexic, the one that I worked with that did die. I worked on dreams with her because I thought that was the safest thing to do, and we actually kept her going 2 or 3 years longer than she would have done. But in the end, she disengaged from the support, which was infrequent at that point, and did involve family therapy, because she was determined to go, and that was, the whole system was orientated towards that. But what I got back from the dream work with her was that she was determined to go.
Yeah.
And this was not at a cognitive level. You could see the shadow, the foreshadowing of her demise was organic, and it was at that level. So I think with anorexics or people with eating disorders of whatever kind, it depends where they're at. And if there is still something healthy in the person to reach, then go for the homeostatic regulation. But where Thanatos is active and is pulling someone in that direction, we may inadvertently only strengthen their destruction. Because for the logic of the system now is, I'm on my way out.
Yeah.
And if you give me the augmented ability to do that, I will go out sooner rather than later. So there is that possibility. I mean, I worked with a guy who died of cancer who was determined to die. And he predicted the date. It would have been 32 years before it actually happened. And he was determined to go. And I actually consulted Ernest Rossi in person, over the phone and through email about this, and got his support. And I said, this is what I'm concerned is going to happen. And having talked to him, we used hypnosis, and I used imagery to do literally with clicking on and deleting at the pixel level cancer cells. All of that appeared to be working, and his medical therapy, his chemotherapy was working. But he told me the day he was going to go, and then suddenly the switch threw a couple of weeks in advance. And it wasn't only the cancer, it was his mind. And he died just after midnight on New Year's Day 2000, exactly as he said he would. So Thanatos had predicted the point, and his whole life was moving towards that. It resisted everything. And even though he appeared to be complying with my attempt to help him, I am left wondering about whether I was being utilized to actually ensure that he would go out on that day and at that time. So I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, so you were appropriated to the Thanatos.
I was appropriated to it, yeah.
And he, as you rightly say, he'd set his clock.
He'd set his clock, and he was determined to go.
Yeah.
But I sought supervision from Ernest Rossi on that, and I thought, this is so serious that I'm going to go to the best guy I know of alive on such matters, and see what he thought about that. And on the basis of that, we made the attempt. And we've done things with other people and got massive reversals, but they didn't have Thanatos at work, and this guy did. It was very sad, but he was a trickster. He lived his life as one, and he paid the price for that in many respects, didn't he? So he kind of trickstered himself into the grave.
It's like with this young woman, though, or was with this young woman, a way of taking herself out of the gene pool. And think about it as well. Had it run its full course, that's what it would have been. And maybe such was her hostility towards her own mother that she would have been prepared to do that almost to end the female line. You know, maybe it went that deep. I don't know. We don't know that was the outcome, but just hypothesizing, had it run its course, Thanatos, in that way, that might have been its goal. Yeah,
because that's the ultimate weapon. That's self-destructive, but also aimed at other people.
Yes, yeah.
So you take others out on your way out.
You do. Yes.
But also it's a kind of collective shit testing.
Yeah.
Also at the subjective level, of course. But then the group around you, can you pull them down with you, or will they be strengthened through repulsion to say, no, I'm not going to do that? And then those people better adapt against the sacrifice that one person has made by saying they're giving in. You can see these dynamics at work.
You can. But you could also see too that in this particular case, had that been, you know, the scenario and had that run its course, that it would have been a way of ending the suffering in that female line, and the poor mothering that had gone on, and so on. So it's like a way of just stopping it there, isn't it? So I'm going to be the person that stops. It's a very an extreme example.
I've seen it with a few people. I can think of several now that you've mentioned it. Women who've done that, decided to have no children, and some of them have adapted only at that level. Others have over adapted and decided to take themselves out as well, as if to make doubly sure that it doesn't happen.
And for those who decide to go on, as in, you know, they don't bring about their own demise, they continue to exist, but they decide not to have children, sometimes would make fabulous mothers. Unfortunately, you see that, and fathers too, because you see men who pull back on it because they see the state of the culture, and they say, oh, I don't want to bring children into a world like this, or my experience was so awful, as well as that it's brought me to a position where I've made that decision, I've made that choice. And again, sometimes you have to help it can be a guiding fiction for some people as well, that they believe that about themselves, and yet in actual fact, if they were allowed their own genome to open up and direct them, they would make the most fabulous mothers and fathers.
They would.
And then it's almost a great shame, it's a loss to the gene pool at that point.
It is.
In that sense, I think, Pauline, as you were speaking about that, I was wondering, so sometimes there might be superficial resistance, but in fact, the person wants to get better. And then there also might be the opposite. A person might appear that they want to get better, but there would be Thanatos would have decided that that it already runs the show.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I mean, I guess the only thing that we can do is just try to help until the end and see what happens.
Yeah.
But is there a way to assess beforehand whether a threshold has been crossed?
Well, possibly, but these things often emerge over time because it's not clear at the beginning what you can do. The guy I mentioned who died from cancer on a clock, I'd known him in the background of my life for decades since and in that sense, that committed me more, I think, to try beyond what I would have done.
That's true.
But he was quite happy to, as you say, Paul, to incorporate me into that.
Yes.
And then you get stuck and you're in the process. I mean, he's been in this room.
He has.
He's been in this.
He's been in our home.
He's been in our home. He's been in this very room.
Yeah.
Because I remember him opening the skylight there and looking out. With Gareth, because Gareth was only young at the time when he was here. He actually held him up and held his head out the window. Funny memory. But things sometimes only appear downstream. So be light on your feet, be barefoot, feel the ground. That's the best advice I could give on that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he had a young son as well, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
He'd come to fatherhood relatively late, as I recall.
Yeah.
But even that wasn't enough to keep him here.
No.
And that original kind of almost bargain, if you like, that he'd made with himself or with Thanatos was in relationship to his mother.
His own mother's death, yeah. He stood at the graveside of his mother's funeral, and as the priest was there, he cursed God in front of the priest and said that I will die on this day at this time. And people took that as being grief, and it obviously was. But he did it. He achieved it. But he achieved so much else in his life that was positive. But there was something like the concentration of factors at that time, the loss of his mother and his sense of power in saying that to a priest and then acting it out, which it's remarkable, but it did happen.
Yeah, it's almost kind of equal and opposite to probably the loss of control that he felt in that moment in terms of how his life just completely changed.
Yeah.
So you could see how it might, things might constellate in that way.
Yeah.
But tragic for the people that he his wife and his son that he left behind.
Yeah.
Because they did not want that to be the outcome.
No.
For sure.
No. One of his friends actually said to me after he died, he said that, I won't say his name, but he said he was the kind of guy who would open a door where all of his friends were in a room and throw a hand grenade in and shut the door and laugh. And I thought, well, I didn't experience him like that, but you know him better than me. And it was that tricksterish element that he had that made him determined to destroy him, because the trickster became his master.
Yeah, turned on him.
It turned on him and led him to his destruction. Weird, but you know, it's a real instance. It really happened.
Yeah.
Are there any possibilities that, for example, since he had a son, maybe in other circumstances, there could have been a spontaneous remission of some sort?
Yeah, all sorts of things happen, don't they? All sorts of combinations. So I think, a different person and different circumstances, the outcome will be very different. That this stands out because it happened. He made his prediction and he did it, and he even induced cancer himself to make sure that he did. No, it's uncanny, but it stands out.
In this final clip, Steve and Pauline discuss the complicated psychosomatic aspect of the case. One of our students undergoing professional training at IPSA raised that, in the case notes, the patient was showing severe signs of being hypercapnic, that is, chronically burned out. The student asked what the patient's capnogram was like, and about when to recommend benzodiazepine prescription, as per the Sabers process from the Charing-Cross method. This gave Steve and Pauline an opportunity to discuss the psychophysiological approach to treatment. In short, as the patient was psychosomatically transducing to such a large degree, they decided it was best that her physiology was addressed first. Then Steve and Pauline discuss the drive state component to anxiety, a part that is often confused with affect or emotion, but is absolutely core to every clinical presentation of anxiety. Complexes are then discussed, both psychodynamically and how they operate within the wider context of physiology and the psychosocial world. Complexes are biopsychosocial.
If I remember correctly, she was a freelance artist, so she principally worked, she was self-employed, worked from home. So at least she didn't have to go out of the house each day to go to a workplace. And so in that sense, she was already in a familiar environment, and she didn't necessarily have those external work pressures that she might have had if she'd have, had that kind of job. So that obviously helped. I agree, it's probably better to introduce the benzodiazepines at the point at which you actually start the Sabres regimen, because there are other things that you can do in the build-up to that to help bring that person's arousal or drive state down anyway. I mean, even just the fact that they're seeking support and they're getting emotional and psychological support is usually effective in and of itself in getting someone to a point where you've built up sufficient trust and rapport for them to trust you when you say, at the point at which you start Sabres and you take the benzodiazepam, and in this case actually I think it was temazepam rather than diazepam, that it is likely to be, and obviously this is part of the suggestion to some extent, that it's likely to be very effective to the point that it will be restorative with respect to your sleep, and also to any kind of chemical imbalance that that's been brought about by the pH dysregulation. So I think it is better to save it for then. I mean, if somebody comes to you and they're already on it, that's a different matter. But I think the initial contact that I had with her, and we had with her too, because there was a point at which her husband came in and we did couples counselling, was sufficient to bring her arousal down to a point where the temazepam was likely to be more effective anyway, and she was likely to need less of it. So it's just all part of the management of it, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
We don't actually have
a capnograph.
No, we don't for this particular case study, unfortunately. But if I remember correctly, I think that the Sabres regimen was sufficient, that it was able to get her to do what it's meant to do, which is to restore her sleep, to reset the respiratory center so that she stops hyperventilating, and you can get her to a position whereby she can balance rest and effort and generally start to feel better about herself. So as far as I recall, that must have improved, because certainly in terms of a psychosocial engagement and a relationship to her husband, we did see improvements, and that would have been unlikely without sorting out her chassis. I mean, you see this over and over again in clinical practice, that if somebody is as shot as she was with respect to her physiological well-being, that it's very, very difficult to get any psychological work to take. So I can only assume, that we would have had a positive outcome with that, because she did benefit in other ways from the clinical work that we did with her. But it would have been lovely. We've got them for other case studies, but we don't have it for her.
No, we don't know. That's all that's left, isn't it?
It's all that's left. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you could see, I think, if I remember correctly, just have a quick look myself at it, with respect to her arousal levels, well, they were ranging from lethargy through to rage and despair, which I think is interesting, because, it suggests that a lot of that exhaustion was probably emotionally driven, and you know, it's the usual thing. If the Panskepian instincts aren't being managed properly, and there's no proper vehicle to express them with respect to, say, meta instincts, then they're likely to duck back down into the body, and people do feel chronically fatigued, exhausted, lethargic, whatever you want to call it. So so much, I think, of what happened with her was of psychosomatic origin, really.
Oh yeah,
there was
definitely the cases.
Yes, there was definitely issues of transduction going on, without a doubt.
Yeah.
But you have to start somewhere, and this is the difficulty. So with something as complex, as complicated as this, I would suggest you start with the chassis, you start with the body, and then you know, work up.
Yeah.
Which I think is what we did.
Yeah, that's the way we work, in an integrated way. Obviously, a purely psychological intervention, say like CBT, for example, would have to rely on other people to do a lot of that. But we don't work like that. You know, we look at everything in that regard. Anxiety, how should that be constructed with respect to a model? For example, there are a lot of videos out there from professionals that make it a psychoreductive issue, whereas clearly it's a drive state.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we learned from Charing Cross, that was more important than anything, was managing the drive state, because the people they were seeing, a lot of them were on the cusp of death. And so long as the drive state was managed, then they could deal with things purely on that basis. Yes. And as I say, a purely psychological approach that ignores that, or can't treat it, or regards it as not being integrated or connected sufficiently, will be psychoreductive, which is, in our view anyway, a nonsensical approach. It's the downstream effects of being in that drive state biopsychosocially, which you see with real people.
Yes.
So we always consider anxiety to be a drive state, rather than and look for any kind of hidden psychodynamic meaning for it. You know, what does this mean in a symbolic sense? You know, if we follow that with someone who is in that kind of state, we'll deplete them further at the very minimum.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And certainly at Charing Cross, they didn't delve into things in a psychodynamic way, but what they did point out was the tendency towards increased emotionalism. That was the expression that they used with somebody who is basically burning out. That is what you see, and the more that they burn out, the more you see the increased emotionalism. And then it's a case of how do you break that cycle, because the more exhausted people are, and the more symptoms that they start to experience because of the transduction, the more distressed they're likely to become emotionally, and on it goes. So you have to break that circle, that cycle, and you have to start, I still believe, with the chassis physiologically. With someone who's as
in that state, for sure.
Who's as burnt out as this young woman was. So some of that language is useful because it takes you away from a psychodynamic explanation. It actually prevents you from digging in too deeply yourself. And it kind of prioritizes things in a very simple way, which I think is helpful.
The normal way that the Jungians think of complexes is that the affect is essentially a product of the ideas being associated to one another. And the affect is kind of secondary to that. So although all of these ideas and associations share a common emotional tone, it's the ideas that collect the emotion to them. And our view is the reverse of that, and at least in most cases. And the argument for that is that when people get into a drive state because they're depleted and exhausted, then, as you've said, because hunger is a form of depletion, instincts ramp themselves up, and we know obviously that instincts are connected deeply to an affect state of consciousness, and then the behavior follows from that, and the frustration is felt at the cognitive level. So the ideas then start to associate around the affect, which itself is representative of a drive state, which is instinctive. So if we take that view, then if we look at this case history, it starts to become clearer than if we look at it only at a psychological level. So the precipitating factors are likely to be instinctive, then emotional, and then they manifest as behavior, and finally as cognition, as a reflexive analysis by the subject of their own behavior and of their own feeling state, and then an attempt to understand it downstream of everything that has caused it. So the cognition is way downstream, yes, and it's probably not the right level to do anything or to attempt to do anything with. So you could say then psychodynamically that all these things are are superpositioned and simultaneously present by the time a person develops an understanding of distress in a cognitive way, at which point then things start to accrue. It's an accretion phenomenon around the core and by now non-ego conscious instinct, and then the affect, and then, as I say, the cognition and the behavior itself forms a very complicated multi-systemic system, which is a complex, a biopsychosocial complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is there are so many physical stresses that can disturb our homeostasis, which I think is what you're saying, hunger just being one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, again, we know with hungry, thirsty, cold, tired, in pain, whatever it happens to be, then that will have an effect. And if you don't take that into account as part of your overall systems assessment, you're missing out a huge amount of information. And some, as I think you're suggesting, Steve, obviously some of the psychological material, the complexes and so on, are probably being represented physiologically anyway. So it's just collating all that information so that you get as big a picture as you possibly can about somebody's psychophysiological state. And you know, this is such a good example of it, really, because there's so many stressors, you know, internal physiological stressors, psychological stresses from the environment, psychosocial stressors, that you can, you know, you can see just what this poor young woman really was up against. It was huge. It was a mammoth feat, really, to try and do anything with that.
It was
material.
It was very complicated.
Very complicated case.
And of course you get the resistances then, which are non-cognitive, and again CBT type therapies will come up against this, that if there is a motivational element to developing the problem over its etiology, over its course of development, that is centered on instinct, then if we deal only with the cognition or attempt to only at that level, then that will only have an effect through suggestion, literally through suggestion and influence at a superficial level. And then the resistance that comes from the person is coming from a deeply non-ego conscious level, which is instinctive, mediated through affect. And an affect level of consciousness is independent of a cognitive level of consciousness. They're actually opposites in many regards. And the CBT approach doesn't make that connection. So then things persist over time, don't they? Because it's not been teased apart.
You even see that, Steve. It might sound like a bit of an aside, but it's not really, because we've got relationship issues going on here with this particular young woman as well. But that when couples argue, they argue from an affect-based level of consciousness. I mean, you hear the Jungians typically going on about, oh, the archetypes are warring, you know, the Anima and the Animus, cat and dog fight type thing. But when you think about the kind of content that comes up in arguments between people, they are usually of an instinctive nature. So that's worth remembering as well. It's not, we don't have sort of, you know, sort of intellectually based cognitive discussions when we argue.
No.
We argue through affect, through emotion, and they're usually highly charged. And the Jungians, you know, tend to say things like, you know, and when the argument's over and we dust ourselves down, we kind of stand back and say, well, what was all that about? We do, you know, what was the meaning of the content? Because you don't actually understand what's happened.
No.
Because they have this mythopoetic way of even looking at arguments, which is so unhelpful. So given the complexity in the relationships, both between this young woman and her husband, and then the family more broadly, you can then maybe see a context for her rage, or unexpressed rage, transduced rage, if you like, coming up, and that then becomes far more helpful than thinking in a psychodynamic or Jungian way about things. It's just, it doesn't cut it in the same way.
No, it doesn't.
No.
So thanks, Paul. So we can apply a psychodynamic model so long as we don't collapse into psychoreductionism, I would say.
Yes.
And when it's joined up, then it will work well. But that means that the psychodynamic level of analysis, description, and explanation needs to be modified by an understanding of the physiology and the emotional and therefore the instinctive levels of processing that are going on. Then we can understand why hysterias occur and how transductions have meaning, because the meaning is non-cognitive, hence it's symbolic.
Steve and Pauline Richards' Discover Your Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook remains the indispensable companion for clearing away complexes, aligning with your anima or animus, discovering your genomic intent, and beginning your individuation journey. We're really pleased to announce that this landmark book is now available in paperback worldwide from Amazon, with a brand new chapter on the trickster function. If you're interested, you're very welcome to check out the link in the description.